"So which is it?" he said, now standing, sand shifting under his feet. "Am I a man you love, or am I a story you're afraid you fell for?" Helen didn't answer, not because she didn't know, because some part of her had wondered the exact same thing, hours earlier, and he'd seen it on her face before she could hide it. He turned and walked into the dark. She sat there alone, 62 years old, engaged to a 27-year-old man she'd known 6 weeks, her son already booking a flight to stop the wedding, his mother already certain this woman would ruin her son's life. Before we go on, check if you're already subscribed and write in the comments which country you're watching from. To understand that beach, you have to go back 6 weeks, back to before the tears, before either of them knew what this would cost. Helen had retired in March, 31 years teaching English literature to teenagers who mostly wanted to be anywhere else. Her husband Peter had been gone 4 years by then, heart sudden, no warning, just gone between one Tuesday and the next. Her son Daniel lived 2 hours away, with a wife and 2 children she saw at Christmas, and sometimes in summer if his work allowed it. Retirement, she'd discovered, is a very quiet room. So when her friend Marion suggested Gambia, warm, cheap, and nobody bothers you, Helen said yes before she'd even looked at a map. She didn't go there to find anything. She went to disappear into sunshine for 2 weeks and stop thinking about the empty side of the bed. The beach near her hotel was called Kotu, long gold littered with fishing boats painted in blues and reds that had faded like old photographs. On her 3rd morning, walking with her shoes in her hand, she saw a young man swearing quietly at a net that had knotted itself into something impossible. She laughed before she could stop herself. He looked up. "You find my suffering funny?" "I find your vocabulary impressive," she said. For a man talking to a net, that was it. That was the whole beginning. No music swelling, no lightning. Just a woman laughing at a stranger's bad mood, and a stranger deciding to laugh back instead of getting offended. His name was Bakary Sour. He wasn't a fisherman by trade. His uncle owned the boat, and Bakary helped some mornings for extra money. What he actually wanted, what he talked about with his hands moving faster than his English, was a bakery. Not a metaphor, an actual bakery. He'd worked 2 years in a hotel kitchen in Serekunda and learned to make bread that he swore tourists cried over. "You are exaggerating," Helen told him, on their second conversation, sitting on an overturned boat while he mended the same net. "One woman actually cried," he said. "German woman. I have witnesses. Witnesses to a crying German woman. Yes, it is documented." She laughed again. She was laughing a lot that week, and it startled her each time, like finding money in an old coat pocket. By the 5th day, she wasn't just walking past his boat, she was walking to it. He had a mother, Fatou, who'd raised him and his 2 younger sisters alone after his father left for Dakar and never really came back. A scar on his left forearm from a job at 14, cutting cane, that he never fully explained and she never fully asked about. A temper he mostly kept quiet except once, when a British tourist made a joke about "you people," and Bakary's jaw went so tight Helen thought he might do something he'd regret. He didn't. He just walked away. He wasn't perfect. Stories like this get flattened into fairy tales, and this wasn't one. He could be proud in a way that made things harder than they needed to be. He didn't like being helped. He didn't like, even more, being seen as someone who needed help. And Helen wasn't perfect either. She was lonely in a way she hadn't admitted to herself. Lonely enough that a 27-year-old's attention felt like sunlight after a long winter, and some small, honest part of her knew she should be careful about mistaking sunlight for something else. So for the first 2 weeks, she told herself it was just friendship, just an old woman and a young man who made each other laugh on a beach neither of them would remember in 5 years. She told herself that right up until the night he asked her not to leave. 2 more weeks, she said. That's what I paid for. 2 weeks and then Manchester and then... She stopped. There wasn't really an "and then." There was just Manchester, grey and quiet, and hers. They were sitting on the sand after the beach bars had closed, the tide loud in the dark. "Stay longer," Bakary said. "I can't, just..." "Why not?" It's a simple question. She didn't have a simple answer. That was the problem. "Because people will ask why," she said finally. "Then tell them," he said, "or don't. But don't leave because of a question you're afraid of, Helen." Nobody had spoken to her like that in years. Not carefully, not gently, just directly, like her life was actually hers to decide. She extended her stay by 3 weeks that night, lying awake afterward, feeling 62 and 17 at exactly the same time, and terrified of both. She called Daniel to tell him. She thought, foolishly she'd see later, that she was calling to share something good. "You're staying longer." "Mum, what's going on?" "Nothing's going on. I like it here. You like it there? Or you like someone there?" Silence has a way of answering questions you don't want to answer out loud. "Mum," his voice changed, not angry yet, worried. "Please tell me you haven't gotten involved with someone." Involved is a strong word. "Mum, he's a friend, Daniel. A good one. His name is Bakary." "How old is this friend?" she told him. The line went quiet in a different way this time. "Mum, do you understand how this looks? Do you understand what people do to women like you out there?" Women like you. She turned that phrase over for days afterward. Lonely women. Widowed women. Women with a pension and a house and nobody checking their bank statements too closely. She didn't know yet that somebody else, a world away in a small compound outside Serekunda, was having almost exactly the same conversation. Fatou Sow found out about Helen from her youngest daughter, who'd seen Bakary with a white woman near the market, laughing. That evening, Fatou asked her son directly. Bakary, to his credit, didn't lie. "She's a friend, Mama." "A friend your age? Does it matter?" "It matters when the friend can buy your whole life with money she has left over after breakfast." Helen only learned the specifics of that conversation much later, from Bakary himself, but it mattered for everything that came after. Fatou wasn't wrong to be afraid. She had seen this story before. Young Gambian men, older foreign women, promises made on beaches that dissolved the moment the plane took off. She had a neighbor whose son had done exactly this, chasing a Swedish woman to Stockholm, and come back 4 years later with nothing but a stamped passport and a bitterness that never fully left him. She wasn't protecting her son from love. She was protecting him from being used and then discarded by someone who could afford to walk away from the wreckage when he couldn't. Helen didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that 3 weeks had turned into 5, and somewhere in Manchester, her son was quietly making phone calls she didn't know about. The first crack came on an ordinary Tuesday. Bakary was unusually quiet over dinner, not sulking, just somewhere else in his head. "What is it?" Helen asked. "Nothing." "Bakary." He turned his glass slowly on the table. "My mother wants to meet you." Something in her chest lifted and dropped at the same time. "That's good, isn't it? She wants to meet you to ask you to leave me alone." She put her fork down. "Oh." "I told her no." "Bakary, I told her no, Helen." His voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. "I am not 17. I don't need her picking who I—" He stopped himself. "Who you what?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. But they both heard the word neither of them had said yet, sitting there in the space between them, like a held breath. Helen met Fatou 3 days later, in her small concrete house with photographs of Bakary at every age, lining one wall like a timeline of a life she'd built with her own hands, alone. Fatou didn't offer her tea, which Helen understood later was its own kind of statement. "You are a kind woman, I think," Fatou said in careful English. "I don't say this to insult you." "Thank you," Helen said, unsure it was a compliment yet. But kindness is not the question. The question is what happens in 1 year, 2 years, when the newness is finished. Her eyes were steady, unblinking, the eyes of someone who had survived things Helen couldn't guess at. "You will go home. You always go home. And my son will be a man with no wife, no children starting, no business, because he spent his best years waiting on a beach for a woman visiting from somewhere better. I'm not visiting him like a tourist attraction, Fatou." "No." Fatou leaned forward slightly. "Then tell me, what is the plan? Where does he live in 5 years? Where does he work? Have you asked him this or only asked yourself if you are happy?" Helen didn't have an answer. That was the moment she understood. This wasn't a story about love conquering doubt. It was a story about whether love could survive one very fair, very frightening question. That night, Helen asked Bakary what he actually wanted. Not for her, for himself. "The bakery," he said immediately. "I told you the first week. How much would you need? Truly?" His jaw tightened, the same way it had with the tourist who'd insulted him. "Don't. I'm not offering money, Bakary. I'm asking a question. It sounds like the beginning of an offer. Why is that so terrible? Because then I am the young man everyone already thinks I am." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "The one who found an old, rich woman on a beach. I'm not rich. You are rich here, Helen. Do you understand that? Everything you have is a fortune here." He stood up, pacing the small room. "If I take your money, I become the story your son already believes. If I don't take it, I stay poor, and you eventually go home to your quiet life and forget the man who fixed nets on a beach. That's not fair. No, he said. It isn't. None of it is. For the first time, Helen saw exactly how impossible this was for him. Caught between his pride and his mother's fear, and a country that had already written his ending before he'd lived it. She went to bed that night with no answers, and a growing, terrifying certainty that she loved him anyway. Daniel arrived 4 days later, unannounced, which told Helen everything about how frightened he actually was. He found her at the hotel, sunburnt and happy, and his face did something complicated when he saw it. "Mum, we need to talk, now." They sat in the hotel restaurant, and he set his phone on the table like evidence in a trial. "I did some research," he said. "This isn't the first time, Mum. There's a pattern here. Older women, usually widows, usually British or German, young men on the beaches. It has a name. People online call it sugar mummy tourism. There are forums, warnings, women who lost their homes. Bakari hasn't asked me for a single pound. Yet, Daniel. I talked to someone at the embassy," he said. "Off the record. She said the pattern is always the same. They wait. They build trust for months, sometimes years before they ask. That's what makes it work." Something cold moved through Helen, not because she believed it, but because for one terrible second, she wondered if she should. That night, the same night this story opened with, she looked at Bakari with suspicion instead of love. For the first time, he saw it. That was the second she'd tried to hide, and failed. She didn't see him for 4 days. 4 days is nothing, and 4 days is also an eternity, depending on what you're waiting for. Daniel, sensing an opening, pushed harder. "Come home with me Thursday, Mum. Just come home. If it's real, it'll still be real in a month, from a distance. And if it's not, then you'll have your life back before you lose anything." She almost said yes. There was a version of that week where she packed her case, flew back to Manchester, and let this become a warm memory to tell at dinner parties. "The summer I nearly did something foolish." But on the third night she couldn't sleep, and she walked down to the beach alone and found Bakari sitting exactly where they'd first properly talked, mending a net that didn't need mending. "You're back," he said, not looking up. "I never left. You were going to." "I thought about it," she admitted. "I won't lie to you about that." He finally looked at her. "Why didn't you?" She sat down beside him on the cold sand. "Because I kept asking myself what I was actually afraid of. And it wasn't you, Bakari. It was being made a fool of. It was people looking at me and seeing a stupid old woman who couldn't tell love from loneliness." She took a breath. "But I've been a teacher for 31 years. I know the difference between a student who's performing and a student who's real. You have never once performed for me." His hands stilled on the net. "My mother isn't wrong to be afraid either," he said quietly. "You should know that. She isn't a cruel woman. She has seen this exact story, Helen. Almost word for word. It ended badly for someone she loved." "I know. So what do we do? Both of them are right to be scared, and we are still sitting here." Neither of them had an answer that night, but for the first time, they were asking the question together, instead of defending themselves from each other. The turn, the actual turn, the one that changed everything, happened almost by accident, 3 days after that. Helen went looking for Bakari at the small building near the market, where he sometimes helped a friend fix motorbikes for extra money, and found him arguing, quietly and urgently, with a man she didn't recognize. She caught only the end of it. "I told you already, I'm not interested," Bakari was saying. "I don't care what she's offering, I don't sell people introductions." The man left, annoyed, and Bakari turned and saw her standing there. "What was that?" she asked. He hesitated, and for one instant she saw him decide whether to lie to her, and then decide not to. "That man runs tours for foreign women," he said. "Specifically, women like you. He offers local men money to be, hosts, companions. He wanted me for a new group arriving next month. Good money," he said. I told him no. "Why?" Bakari looked at her like the question hurt him. "Because it would make everything between us a business, Helen. And whatever this is, I don't actually know what to call it yet. It was never that. I would rather have nothing than have you find out later that this began as a transaction." She stood there in the heat of that little street, and something settled in her that hadn't settled in weeks. This was the moment she finally understood. Daniel's fear was reasonable, given what he'd read. Fatu's fear was reasonable, given what she'd lived. But neither fear was actually about this man in front of her, choosing again and again the harder and poorer road, because the other one would have cost him his own respect for himself. She went home that night and wrote Daniel a long email. She didn't ask him to approve. She asked him to trust that she was still, despite everything, the woman who had raised him, capable of telling the difference between being loved and being used. He didn't reply for 2 days. When he did, it was one line. "I'm coming out there. I need to see this for myself, Mum, please." She agreed. Some part of her wanted him to see it too, so the fear could finally have somewhere to go besides phone calls. Daniel arrived guarded, arms crossed at the airport, scanning the crowd like he expected to see his mother's savings already gone. He met Bakari 2 days later, at Helen's insistence, over dinner none of them particularly enjoyed. "So," Daniel said, in the tone of a man conducting an interview, "what are your plans exactly? For work, for the future?" "A bakery," Bakari said simply. "I've been saving for 3 years. I have about 1/3 of what I need. And my mother's money would help with the rest, I imagine." "I've refused her money twice," Bakari said, and Daniel's face shifted very slightly. "Ask her yourself." Daniel looked at Helen. She nodded. "Then what do you actually want from her?" Daniel asked, quieter now. Bakari considered the question with more seriousness than Daniel had probably expected. "I don't know yet what shape it takes," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I have some clean answer for you. I know that when I'm with your mother, I feel like a whole person, not half of one waiting for the rest of my life to start. I know that scares you. It scares my mother too. But I'm not asking either of you to trust me completely yet. I'm asking you to trust that your mother knows her own mind." Daniel didn't say anything for a long moment. "She's my mother," he said finally, voice rough. "My father died and I've watched her disappear a little more every year since. If this is real, I need it to actually be real, because I can't watch her get hurt like that again." "Neither can I," Bakari said. "That's the one thing we agree on completely." It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was the first conversation where nobody was performing for anybody, and Helen sat there quietly grateful that both of them, in their own stubborn ways, were trying to protect the same person. Fatou was harder. Fatou didn't soften over one dinner, but 3 weeks later something happened that changed her more than any conversation could have. Bakari had been offered informally a small loan from a cousin in Dakar, enough, combined with his savings, to actually open a modest version of the bakery. No foreign money involved at all. He'd been quietly building toward this the entire time they'd been arguing about money. None of them had actually exchanged. He asked Helen to come see the space he'd found, a small shopfront 2 streets back from the market, empty, dusty, perfect. "I wanted you to see it before I told my mother," he said, "because you believed the bread was good before anyone else did." Standing in that empty room, smelling plaster dust and hot tin roof, Helen understood something she hadn't let herself say out loud yet. She didn't want to go back to Manchester and visit this life on holidays. She wanted to be in it. She told Fatou herself a week later, without Bakari in the room. "I'm not leaving in September," she said. Fatou studied her for a long moment. "You said that before. About 3 weeks. Now it is forever?" "I don't know if it's forever," Helen admitted. "I'm 62, Fatou. I've buried a husband. I know better than most people that nothing is forever. But I know I'm not here to be entertained by your son, and I'm not here to be rescued from being lonely, and I'm not here to buy anything, including him." "Then what are you here for?" "To find out what happens next," Helen said. "Same as him. Same as anyone." Fatou was quiet for a long time. "My husband left when Bakari was 6, she said finally. "He told me it would be forever too. I have learned not to trust that word from anyone. I'm not your husband, Fatou." "No," Fatou said. "You aren't." She looked at her carefully. "But you are also not finished proving it isn't the same story." It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't a door closing either. And for the first time, Helen understood that Fatou wasn't her obstacle. She was, in her own guarded way, exactly what Daniel had been the whole time. Someone terrified of losing the person they loved to a story that had eaten other families whole. Which brings us back to that airport bathroom, because there's one more night that hasn't been told yet, the one that decided everything. Bakari had asked Helen to marry him, not with a ring, not with any theatre, just quietly on the sand, the same stretch where he'd once walked away from her, and the same stretch where they'd first sat together, arguing about tangled nets. "I'm not asking because of a passport," he said, before she could even respond. "I know that's the first thing anyone will think. I'm asking because I don't want to keep measuring my life in how many weeks you have left before a flight." She said yes before her mind had even finished catching up to her mouth. So the decision in that bathroom, gripping a sink that wasn't clean, staring at a woman in the mirror she didn't fully recognize, wasn't whether to stay with him. It was whether she had the courage to walk past the gate to Manchester and trust that the people who loved her would eventually catch up to a truth she already knew in her body. She looked at herself in that mirror a long time. Then she walked out, past the gate to Manchester, and called Daniel. "Mum, where are you? Your flight board's in—" "I'm not getting on it, Daniel." Silence. "I love you," she said, before he could speak. "And I need you to hear that this isn't me running from my life. This is me choosing it for the first time in longer than I can tell you. I'm staying. Bakari asked me to marry him. I said yes." She heard him breathe out, long and shaky on the other end. "Mum, I know what this looks like from where you're standing," she said. "I know the pattern you read about. I know Fatu's fears too now. I've sat with them, Daniel, longer than you have. But I have watched that young man refuse money twice. I have watched him choose pride over comfort more times than I can count. Whatever this is, it was never the story you were afraid of." There was a long pause. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not still scared," Daniel said finally. "I know, but I heard something in your voice just now that I haven't heard since before Dad died." His voice cracked slightly. "I don't want to be the reason you go back to sounding like you did before." "Then come to the wedding," she said. "See it for yourself. Properly this time." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay, Mum, okay." The bakery opened 4 months later, smaller than Bakari had dreamed, bigger than anyone had expected. Fatu came to the opening. She didn't say much, but she took a piece of the bread he'd once bragged about making a stranger cry over, and Helen watched her eyes go soft in a way she hadn't seen since the day they met. Daniel came to the wedding, standing a little stiffly in the heat in a suit entirely wrong for the climate, and cried anyway. In the exact moment, Bakari turned to look at Helen like she was the only person on that beach. People still ask her, back on the rare visits home, if she isn't afraid. If she doesn't wonder what happens in 10 years, when she's an old woman and he's still relatively a young man. She tells them the truth. She doesn't know what happens in 10 years. Nobody ever does at any age, with anyone. What she knows is this. She spent 4 years after Peter died waiting quietly for her life to be over, because that's what everyone expected of a widow her age. And then she went looking for 2 weeks of sunshine and found a young man arguing with a net on a beach, and somehow, against every reasonable fear his mother and her son ever had, they built something neither of them could deny, once they actually looked at it honestly. Love didn't erase the difference between them. It never does, no matter what the films tell you. It just gave them both, finally, a good enough reason to stop being afraid of the questions and start living inside the answers instead.